This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Podker. Atlantic surf clams are a commercially viable variety of shellfish, commonly used in soups, chowders, and stews. They are sustainable due to their early reproduction age and the long lifespans that follow. But in the 1990s, Atlantic surf clams largely died off in their southernmost range off the coast of Virginia, causing the commercial fishing operations looking for them to move north. But recently, it was discovered that the species appear to be staging a comeback in the area. We are joined by Daphne Munroe, Associate Professor in the Haskin Shellfish Lab at Rutgers University. Professor Munroe, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Nathan.
So I'd like to start with a little bit of background, and I want to ask you how you got interested in shellfish.
I got started in shellfish as a graduate student, actually as a late undergraduate. In my very last semester as an undergraduate, I was introduced to this idea of shellfish farming. And the idea was really compelling to me because it was like this way to produce protein for human consumption that was very low impact, highly sustainable. And so when I got into grad school, I decided I wanted to pursue ecological questions that were centered around shellfish aquaculture and how these farms interact with natural ecosystems on the coast. And I guess the bottom line is I haven't looked back. I've been working with shellfish ever since. And it's been a really rewarding science journey for me. I've gotten to work with all kinds of really interesting people to whom shellfish is a living, right? They farmers who handle shellfish and grow shellfish on their farms, fishermen, in this case, some of the work we've been doing more recently here in New Jersey, fishermen who make a living on the water harvesting shellfish, again, for human consumption. And so from a science perspective, it's been really fascinating because I get to ask these really interesting applied questions that have really cool science implications, but also really important meaning to people's daily lives.
So as we head towards the work that brought you to my attention today, I want to ask you some of the basics on the way there. Can we define what an Atlantic surf clam is specifically?
Yeah, an Atlantic surf clam is kind of it's a clam, just like many other clams. But what makes it unique is it lives a really long time compared to some shellfish, but it also grows to a very large size. I've got an example here of a shell. So this is beside my head.
That's definitely a bit larger than what I'm used to seeing.
Yeah, they're really, really big. And this isn't even one of the biggest ones. This would be maybe a middle-aged clam. They get much bigger than this, but this would be about the typical size they collect in the fishery. And so that's a couple of the interesting things. And in terms of longevity, they live to, their late 30s would be about as old as we see them. So it's a pretty long time. What's cool about them, Nathan, is they become reproductive in like the first or second year of life, and they reproduce every year from then on. So you're talking about a super fecund animal that puts out a lot of reproduction capacity. They live on the continental shelf off of New Jersey. Atlantic surf clams. There are other surf clam species in the world that live in other places, but our particular species that we've been focusing on lives on the continental shelf, which is the big, flat, sandy bottom habitat off New Jersey. They like the sand. They like the flat bottom. They tend to be, even though they live off the coast of New Jersey, they tend to be a kind of a cold water species. They prefer colder conditions, which actually is well supported here. You wouldn't think that if you're somebody who comes to the Jersey Shore, to the beach in the summer, because it's very warm. But what happens off the coast of New Jersey is we get very strong thermal stratification. And what that means is very warm water that's heated up by the sun in the ocean that kind of gets separated from cold water on the bottom where the surf clams live, which kind of creates this like refrigerated bottom water condition that the clams love. It's perfect for them. And so this stratified condition off the New Jersey coast, and in fact, it's some of the most stratified water in the world. That stratification layer kind of insulates the habitat for those surf clams that live off the shore here. So it's perfect conditions for this species, even though it's a little bit of a colder water species than what you would expect for this latitude. They do very well here.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about how they interact with the environment? Like what kind of impacts do they have to the area around it?
Yeah, shellfish in general are what we tend to think of as kind of ecosystem positive animals, right? I won't say ecosystem engineers because it comes with some connotation, but they tend to be filter feeders, right? So they they take water into their bodies that has all the stuff in the water that is floating around, including their food, but also including other things that maybe they don't feed on. But in both cases, they take that into their body. They either feed on the stuff they want to feed on, or they spit out the stuff they don't want to feed on. And when they do that, they're taking those particulates out of the water column and helping to clear the water. So that's one of the biggest ways that they interact with the ecosystem. In some cases, their shells, once they die, can become part of the carbonate reservoir in the sediments that we think is sometimes really important for certain ecosystem characteristics. Yeah, so they're kind of a net. We tend to think of shellfish as a net positive animal in the ecosystem.
Now, can we talk a little bit about the history of the Atlantic surf clam? I understand that earlier they were further south than they are currently, and that kind of ties in with some of the paper that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, the range of the Atlantic surf clam extended in particular the fishable stock, right? So when we think about with fisheries, we tend to think about what we consider the fishable stock. So these are abundance of a population that is high enough to support a commercial fishery. And so that distribution of the population used to extend down to off the mouth of the Chesapeake, let's say off Virginia, all the way up to Georges Bank off Massachusetts, off Cape Cod. And the habitat, in fact, actually extends further north than that, but again, fishable quantities, right? So that's where we tend to think of the bulk of what the fishable part of the stock occupied. And there used to be even processing plants. So there was enough fishing boats operating out of ports off Maryland and Virginia that it supported processors down in Virginia and Maryland. And in the last 2 to 3 decades, that's shifted. Processing capacity has been moving north. The boats have been moving north. And that's largely because the number of clams in the southern part of the range has been diminishing. A lot of what we expected that to be related to were warm temperature conditions as the ocean's been warming. Not only is the surface warming, that's what we observe more often, but the bottom's also been warming, which has been shifting the habitat northward and to a certain degree into deeper water where water's a little bit colder. And so that's a little bit of what we've been observing in the last 2 to 3 decades in that stock.
And then I understand that at some point you got a call or an email or a message of some sort from a fisher-related person that you worked with about finding some quantities further south than there has been.
That's right. Yeah. And so again, I'll kind of touch back to where we started in this conversation, right? As I feel very fortunate to work with some very intelligent people who make a living either farming or fishing shellfish. And a lot of what I get to explore as a scientist comes by way of these conversations with these folks who really have their fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the ecosystem. So I feel very, very fortunate to have those collaborators, if you will, in my network. And so, yeah, this goes back to in the fall of 2021. One of the fishermen that I contact quite often with questions, a lot of times on my side of things, and he likewise, he has ideas on his side of things. He called me up and he said, Daphne, we've got 4 or 5 boats working out of Cape Charles, which is a port in Virginia at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, catching surf clams. And I kind of said, are you sure? That's not what we think should happen. Because as we said before, right, we had been observing a stock migration northward over the past 2 to 3 decades. And to have 5 boats stationed down there working full time is substantial, right? That means that they wouldn't afford to be there if they weren't actually catching the clams. So, he and I talked a little bit more about it, and we said, well, we need to take some samples. We need to look at what's going on. And the reason was, I was saying to him, well, our expectation is that these clams, one, shouldn't be there in fishable abundances. And if they are, were interested in knowing a bit more about their health. Are these normal clams? We also were curious to know if they represented kind of a weird, anomalous recruitment event, like 5 or 10 years ago, did we have this weird thing happen where a bunch of surf clams survived there and that's what they're fishing off of, is a single weird recruitment event? Or has this been a sustained recovery of some kind that we didn't expect? So we worked with the fishing company. They were catching clams as they normally would. And because the processing plants don't exist down there anymore, what they were doing was bringing those clams by truck from Cape Charles off the mouth of the Chesapeake up to a processor in New Jersey, which is just actually around the corner from my lab. And so the fisherman we were working with, his name is Tom. Tom helped us coordinate with when the trucks were going to be arriving with the catch. And so he'd call us up and say, the trucks are arriving at 3 a.m., be over there by 6 in the morning. And so I brought my students over and we collected clams from the catch that had been trucked up to this processor around the corner from us. And we did some sampling on those clams.
So looking into those clams, what kind of results were you seeing? Which of those mysteries were you kind of revealing there?
It was really, really interesting. So we did a number of things to try to evaluate what the population looked like there, right? So one thing that's cool with clams is they're kind of like trees. They have annual growth rings in their shell. And you can see it a little bit in this shell. I'm going to put this up to the camera. You can see it a little bit. This is a bit of an older, but you can see kind of the concentric rings.
Yeah.
And what we do in the lab is we cut the shell through this bit right here in the hinge called the chondrophore. And we cut it and then we polish it up. And I don't know if this is going to work or not, but I'm going to put this up to the camera. I don't know if you can see that or not. It might be too washed out. But in this bit of the shell, the annual growth lines become very clear. And we polish it up and then we put it under a microscope and we can count how many rings this particular clam has, and we can estimate how old it is. And we can also then we can also measure how big it is. We can take the meats out and we can weigh the meats so we can have an idea of how fat and happy it is for its size. And so when we looked at all of that, we found that we saw everything from about 3-year-old clams, which means those ones recruited there about 3 years ago, all the way up to 9-year-old clams and everything in between, which tells us that that's a population that wasn't just there because a weird thing happened 10 years ago, but instead something has changed that's allowing those clams to come back and recruit every year. We didn't see anything older than about 9 years old. So something about a decade ago suggests something in that time range shifted. They also, when we looked at how heavy their meats were inside their shell, for a given size of clam, they were about as fat and happy as we would expect for that size, which was also a bit of a surprise because we expected that down on that southern edge of the range, if that habitat had been degrading over time, they may have been a little less fat and happy, right? And so everything checked out, that they seem to be recruiting frequently. They seem to be just as big as they should be for their given size. And so it leads us to this now mystery of what happened, how to make this, to support this change, right? And there's a couple of things that could happen, right? You could have a change in the environment that now allows that environment to be okay to support those surf clams again. 2, you could have biological adaptation. It could be that those animals on the edge of the range over time were experiencing stressful conditions and for some reason changed genetically in some way to adapt to that different condition. And we haven't tested for that, or some combination of the two. And so we don't really know what's happened yet, but we do know that something's happened that's different than what we had expected when we, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when we had kind of understood that the clams had moved out of that southern portion of the range.
So thinking about that, what are your next steps towards finding that out? Do you research the meats of the clams more, or do you go out and check out the environment more? or both?
A little bit of both, Nathan. I think that's great, and maybe more, right? I think so. We have since then been able to go back down there and do some more scientifically driven sampling. So what I've been talking about so far were clams that were collected out of the fishery. Right. A fishing boat doesn't randomly select animals from the environment, right? They're fishing, so they're selecting a certain subset of the population. And so in order for us to understand scientifically what's going on, we need to sample randomly. And so we've been able to go back and sample in a more random way to kind of get a big look at the wider population, not just what the fishermen would be selecting for. We also have been doing some work with colleagues who do hydrodynamic modeling, ocean models, basically predicting what the ocean looks like based on observations from discrete locations and then integrating that in computer models. And so we've been using some of those computer models to try to hindcast the environment to see if we can understand how things have looked over the past 10, 20 years. We've done some environmental sampling, but I'll say that one of the things that's a challenge for me as a shellfish biologist is the bottom of the ocean is massively undersampled, right? We sample the surface of the ocean a ton, right? We've got satellites that can look at the surface. We have all kinds of moorings that send signals out and measure the surface of the ocean continuously. We have very, very few options for doing that on the bottom. And so we're doing our best to get as much data as we can, but it's limited, right? But one of the other things that we're looking at is there's a subspecies of surf clams that grows to a smaller body size and lives a shorter amount of time. It's a cryptic subspecies. And what that means is it's morphologically the same as the surf clams that we know. But this subspecies tends to live in shallower, warmer water conditions than the surf clam that I just was telling you about that really likes the colder water conditions. And so the other question we've been asking is, could this be an introgression of the southern subspecies into the southern edge of the range? Or could it be some kind of a hybridization of the two? And so we're doing a number of experiments around that. We're trying to create hybrids in the lab that we can do physiological testing on. We're also taking a look genetically at the distribution of the genotypes in the clams in the southern edge of the range, but also in other parts of the stock. And these are also studies that are being done not just by my lab, but other lab groups, including some folks at Cornell who are doing some really cool work in this space. And so I think there's a lot of questions, right? And but I think the one thing I'll say, and I think this is like my take-home message from this, and I love working with students on questions like this, where we come into this space and we say, oh, no, we know how this animal works. We've been observing a shift in the habitat. And then, suddenly a phone call and they tell you they're fishing in this place that the stock apparently had gone away. So the take home to me is, as a scientist, always listen, always be willing to hear that you might not understand the system properly, right? So there was something that we didn't understand about what had gone on down there. And, the fishermen came knocking to say, hey, there's something happening that maybe we can learn from. And so I think that's the thing that I want to convey from this research. Obviously, there's some really cool surf clam stories, but the broader message is be open to these signals that are unexpected, because the observations are really what we should be listening to and not what our expectations are, right?
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is kind of ocean acidity and acidification and what you're seeing. How do shellfish populations react to this kind of stressor? Ocean
acidification is an interesting one with shellfish. Shellfish we expect because they make a carbonate shell, right? They make a calcium carbonate shell. And ocean acidification modifies the carbonate system in the ocean water, right? So it changes the availability of carbonate for critters like shellfish to make the building blocks of their skeleton, their shell. And so we expect that shellfish may be vulnerable to ocean acidification stress. However, I think we really don't understand how that works very well yet. And I say that because some of what we understand comes from lab studies. So we've done there's been a whole bunch of stuff done in the laboratory where you put the animals into acidified ocean that you create in the lab, and then you measure their response. Less of that has been done in the real world. And in the real world, unlike the lab, there's kind of daily variations in the carbonate system. There's tidal variations and things like that. And so in order to really understand how animals will actually respond to that, we need a lot more information from the field. And I think it's starting to get there. But one of the places that we think is the most vulnerable life stage is the larval stage. Those are swimming zooplankton. So these shellfish make offspring that swim around in the ocean for a period of time. With surf clams, it's up to somewhere around 20 to 25 days. Oysters, it can be 12 to 20 days. It's species specific how long they're swimming as zooplankton. But because they're swimming and their shell is a slightly different carbonate structure, we think they potentially are more vulnerable to ocean acidification stress than an adult surf clam that's kind of big and robust and has a kind of a stable shell resource. Also, a lot of times those clams are living in the sediments that are already pretty acidified. So questions about, how does ocean acidification look to a shellfish that lives in the bottom that tends to be a more acidified condition than the surface ocean, for example.
Special thanks to Daphne Munroe. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Bodker. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.